The Munsters premiered on September 24th, 1964, and this show was an immediate ratings success. The show stars Fred Gwynne. He plays the Frankenstein-like monster and the head of the household, Herman Munster. Yvonne De Carlo plays his wife, LILY Munster, and Al Lewis plays Lily's father, Grandpa. Beverly Owen, who was later replaced by Pat Priest, plays the teenage niece, Marilyn Munster. And she didn't have any monster features at all. She was attractive by conventional standards, but it made her the ugly duckling of the family. Butch Patrick was the werewolf-looking son, Eddie Munster. The show was actually created by the same team that gave us Leave It to Beaver. Joe Conley and Bob Mosier were the ones that did the producing and writing for the classic sitcom Leave It to Beaver. They always practiced write what you know, and they based everything on Leave It to Beaver on basic things that had happened to them throughout their life. And they really used this same philosophy when they created this sitcom about a suburban blue-collar family that just happened to be comprised of monsters. You see, they didn't want children to be frightened by their characters the way they would be if they watched Frankenstein or Dracula during a creature feature. So they ended up making Herman a typical working dad who carried a lunchbox to work every day and who imparted homespun wisdom to his young son. The mother was actually caring and nurturing, even though she did concoct some absolutely crazy dinners. This was basically a fun monster family that was really just a slice of down-home Americana. Now, when Fred Gwynne would eventually start reminiscing about his part as Herman, and he actually would call it one of his favorite characters later on, but the time that he spent actually on the Munster set was often a really miserable time. And this was all thanks to the various devices that he had to wear to transform him into this lovable Frankenstein monster. On his feet, he wore these asphalt paver boots that had 4-inch soles on them. His thighs, arms, and his torso were covered in about 40 pounds of foam rubber padding. This caused him to contend with back problems daily because of the weight of the suit, and his shoes just weren't flexible. His head was actually fitted with a foam latex piece to flatten the top of his head, and before each filming, he would have to endure 2 hours in the makeup chair. He was just sweating profusely under this heavy costume and under the hot studio lights. It said that he would lose 10 pounds despite actually consuming gallons of lemonade in between takes. The producers actually eventually came up with a compressed air tank that they could poke the nozzle inside his collar to blow cool air on him. As the Munsters gained popularity, the stars of the show received more and more requests to appear in various functions. The producers would send the actors out as often as possible to do these type of appearances because it helped promote the show, and it also propelled the sales of various Munster merchandise that saturated that market at the time. The only one that didn't have to do this was Fred Gwynne. He was able to relax on his days off, for the most part, since the actual time and expense required to get him into character outweighed the publicity value of cutting ribbons at a supermarket opening. There is one time that he shows up in a pretty prominent place in public, and that's in 1964, and he shows up alongside Al Lewis for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Fred Gwynne actually confessed to TV Guide afterwards that he had been taking slugs from a bottle of whiskey the entire time that he was there because he had to get completely bombed so that he could say hello to the little kiddies for 40 blocks worth of parade. Now, the Munster Coach was actually built by the same company that created the Batmobile. It was the Hollywood custom car builder, Barris, who actually built this crazy-looking car. He used 3 Model T Ford bodies to construct the 18-foot-long Munster mobile. The brass radiator and fenders were hand-formed, and the velvet upholstery was done in blood red. It took him 21 days to complete the project with a cost of $18,000. Now, the part of Marilyn was actually played by two different actresses. But believe it or not, it wasn't the producer's choices that led to this. It was the decision by the actress herself. The New York-based Beverly Owen played Marilyn for the first 13 episodes, but she was just desperately unhappy working in California. She missed her fiancé, who was back on the East Coast. The rest of the cast kind of intervened on her behalf and talked the producers into releasing her from her contract. She went home, got married, and eventually got a role on the soap opera Another World, which was filmed in New York. Now, Pat Priest took over this role, and she actually got this role because of her size. You see, she was actually the same height and weight and exactly the same measurements as Beverly Owen was. And this meant that all of the existing Marilyn costumes and the accessories that went with it fit her perfectly. So there would actually be no need to spend more money on a replacement wardrobe. So she was hired. And believe it or not, she looked so much like the original one that a lot of the viewers didn't even realize the difference. Nate Happy Durman played the wolf boy Eddie Munster in the pilot, but the network just wasn't pleased with his performance. He was then replaced by Butch Patrick, and he played the role of Eddie more like a pointy-eared version of Beaver Cleaver. Now, Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis played so well off one another during the entire show, and part of this was because they had had a few years of practice at it. They had co-starred together as officers in the TV sitcom Car 54, Where Are You?, that ran from 1961 to 1963. These two guys were really close friends. They remained friends long after The Munsters was canceled. Now, Universal Studios owned Universal Television, which owned The Munsters. Universal Studios also owned all the copyrights to most of the classic monsters, including Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster. The studio had been running all their old classic horror films on television since the 1950s, and they found out that there was still an impressive audience for these decades-old monster movies. When the producers Conley and Mosier pitched their idea for the series, CBS executives knew they had one advantage over ABC. They had the ability to use the entire Universal Monster characters catalog. The Munsters regularly topped the Addams Family in ratings because their characters were so much more identifiable. They had a built-in fan base. Herman's boss, Mr. Gateman, was often discussed, but he appeared in only 2 episodes. He was played by John Carradine in the episode Herman's Raise in 1965, and then in The Musician in 1966. Now, Eddie's pet dragon that lived under the stairs was named Spot. A full body for the dragon was never built. Only the head could be seen when the staircase was open, and sometimes his tail section was visible on a few occasions. Now, the part of Lily was actually originally Phoebe, and she was also played by 2 different actresses. In the unaired pilot, Miss Munster was played by Joan Marshall. But then when the show was picked up as a series, the CBS brass were worried that her look and her on-screen demeanor was too similar to Carolyn Jones, who played Morticia Addams in the rival show on ABC. The producers were asked to recast the role with a new actress and to change the name. Now, Fred Gwynne and Al Lewis were not really pleased when they heard that the role went to Yvonne De Carlo, that she had been hired to replace Joan Marshall. Now, initially, they had never met her, but they were very intimidated by her reputation as a Hollywood glamour queen. She was a true bona fide movie star. They didn't think that she would fit into their brand of comedy. They thought she was all wrong for the part. But they found out that her comedic timing was actually great, that she fit in pretty well while the cameras were rolling. But in between the takes of scenes, she kept mainly to herself in the trailer. She didn't have a whole lot to do with anybody on the set. She often held up production while having minute adjustments done to her hair, her makeup, and nails. And all of this just aggravated the heck out of the cast and crew. It held up production. She actually went through 5 different hairdressers on the show during the show's 2-year run. She was never satisfied with anybody. She was one of these girls that was definitely a joy to look at, but maybe not so much to be around. Now here's a point that's kind of interesting to me, that during the first season's opening credits, they did an outrageous parody on the opening credits of the Donna Reed show, which always began with Donna Reed lovingly passing out lunches to her departing family members as they left the house one by one. Yvonne De Carlo, as LILY Munster, did the same thing. You can find this show in syndication in a lot of areas. It's fun to watch. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.